Welcome to Words on Air. My guest is Heid E Erdrich. She is the author of 6 collections of poetry, most recently curator of ephemera at the New Museum for Archaic Media, and 2 anthologies of literature by Native writers, most recently New Poets of Native Nations. She grew up in North Dakota, and she is Ojibwe enrolled at Turtle Mountain. Such an honor to have you here. Your work has been so important in my own teaching and my own scholarship, and also to this broader community of poets all over, and especially Indigenous writers. And I just finished sharing Curator of Ephemera with my graduate students, and also with a book club that we have here in town. And there are a few things about this book that has just really knocked our socks off. And probably the foremost is this use of technology and the QR codes that link to your poem films. Mm-hmm. So could you talk a little bit more about the role of technology and this multimedia sort of thrust to your work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it began because I was working with visual artists as a curator and art program director, and I got interested in the idea of how I could continue curating while creating poetry, and it became both responding to visual artists, and then I wanted to work with visual artists to create film. I was just going to do book trailers at first, and as I started working with the images, the moving images, I got more interested in creating these little films, little poem films, and we call them poemios. And once I had a book ready, collected the poems, I thought, well, how am I going to include them? Because to me, they're also poems.
Yeah.
And the way to do it was to use these QR codes so that people can just point their phone at it and go straight to the film.
Does it feel like it's a different meaning that comes across with the film versus the written version?
I think it depends on which piece that I am able to create in 2 formats. Some of them are in more than 2 formats. Sometimes I think it just draws out the imagery that I wouldn't expect every reader to get.
Okay.
And other times I'm able to include other voices that I'm hearing or other music that I'm hearing in the film version. So it's more of how the poem happens in my head. And it's a closer, sometimes it's much closer than the way it would be if I just read it aloud to someone.
Well, you also include a lot of music in the collection, and you have this wonderful mixtape didactic series where you sort of have handwritten liner notes from cassettes like we used to make from mixtapes, you know, back in the day. So you've got the films, the poemios, the mixtapes. You're so immersed in visual art. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you see curation as poetic, or how as a poetic voice are you sort of curating all of these things?
No, I think that in my poetry I've always had a bit of a essay-like quality. There's usually been some theory or some way of looking at the world that I've tried to create a thesis on through my poems, through descriptions of experiences, or looking at museum practices, for instance, in that book National Monuments. So in this one I'm able to do some of the same things. My ideas about contemporary Native poetry, contemporary Native art, and some of the things that Native artists are dealing with, and some of the things that I have in common with it. So that's sort of the basis of it. And then also just this idea of mishearing things. That's a big part of my use of lyrics from songs, is that I feel like I've often misheard a lyric, and yet I've created some sort of thesis or understanding of the world based on my mishearing. And it makes it clear to me that we use all these different media, but we mishear each other, and we are communicating less and less, even though communications is a huge industry, and we're all take part in it all the time, but we understand each other less.
Well, I wanted to give you a chance to read, and I wondered if you would share the poem Preoccupied.
Okay. Preoccupied is one that has a film with it, and I'm looking for the page because I don't have the page in my head. The film of Preoccupied came after I made it for a website, so it had links to images and films and so forth, and it looks okay on the page, and I like it on the page, but it was meant to be a multimedia piece from the beginning. So it was the first poem film I made with a huge crew of native animators, visual artists, music folks, and audio folks. So it does take a little while to read it. So Preoccupied. River, 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 I never, never, never etched your spiral icon in limestone, or, for that matter, pitched a tent on cement near your banks of marble stock still, all movement in the plaza. River walking its message on an avenue rallied in bitter wind. Excuse my digression, my mind tends. In reality, my screen is lit with invitations. Bake a casserole, send pizza, make soup for the 99%. Sorry, somehow I haven't time. Flow, flow, flow both ways in time. There's a river to consider after all. No time, no hours, no millennia, no decades, no, I cannot dump cans of creamed corn and turkey on noodles and offer forth sustenance again. A bit preoccupied, we original 100%, who are also 1% more or less, simply distracted by sulfide emissions, tar sands, pipelines, foster care, polar bears, hydrofracking, and the playlist deeply intoning, Superman never made any money. River, 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 our river, map of the Milky Way, reflection of stars from whence all life commenced. 100% of all life on our planet. River in the middle, Mississippi, not the East Coast Hudson where all this started. Waterway, Max Fleischer's team lushly rendered via the wonder of Technicolor. Emerging from an underwater lair, a mad scientist we comprehend as indigenous has lost his signifiers. No braids, no blanket. But we recognize him. A snappy dresser who flashes a maniac grin. He is not your TV Indian, ignoble savage. And I still say Manhattan rightfully belongs to my people. Superman. Possibly, but just what do you expect the Daily Planet to do about it? Occupy, occupy, worked for the 99%. Occupy, reoccupy, Alcatraz and Wounded Knee. Sorry, somehow now I've too much time. Flow, flow, flow both ways, story, history, story. There's a river that considers us after all. All time, all hours, all decades, all millennia. River, river, river. I never, never, never. But that is not to say that I won't ever.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And there's actually a whole
right
page of notes that I usually read very quickly, like a pharmacy ad.
Well, every time I teach this poem, I notice that my students are getting farther and farther from 2011 when Occupy Wall Street really kicked off. And so I'm having to do a little more explaining. But that word occupy, though, they immediately notice the charge of that word. And so this poem really speaks to some of the blind spots of activism or these different kinds of movements. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the different pieces that you're bringing together in the poem sort of try to overcome those blind spots, like the image of the river, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that's something, very deep and very much part of our understanding, landscape as being important to Native people, water as being important to all of us. And so that is the centering image for that poem. And I did the poem and the poem film before the Standing Rock, before some of the Canadian protests and activism around song and dance. And I was just trying to imagine what would it be for an Indigenous activism to take hold? What would it be like? I think that it would be different, and I didn't know exactly how it would be different from the Occupy movement. But I do hope it's an invitation for people to look at, what is this? And that's why it has all the notes with it too. There's all these footnotes that tell you to go look at this cartoon where there's this Indigenous supervillain, and it was one of the earliest Max Fleischer Superman comics, and it was before he said truth, justice, and the American way, and that's why I could use it in the film. It was before it was in copyright even. So.
Wow. Well, I wanted to take a moment to ask you a little bit more about your work as a mentor. I know you've been so involved in, for example, the Loft Literary Center and all kinds of different residencies. What do you think is important about mentoring for fostering a really thriving literary and arts community? Certainly we have high hopes here of creating our own Loft Tulsa, but what kinds of things do you think are important?
Well, I think for any artist in any discipline, it's important to know that a working artist is a human being who has, a job, and there are parts of the job to do that you need to, learn how to, aside from the art and the inspiration and the technique, there's also, the business of the writing world, the business of the arts world. There's the balancing of your human life and your family life and your community life with your art. There's being a good citizen of the arts. All those things are things I learned from a mentor, and in an informal way, and I wanted to share them when I mentored. And also I had been a university professor for a long time, and I missed mentoring right in the Native community. There's a big Native community in the Twin Cities, so being a mentor in a community setting made it easier for me. And I now work with a cohort of MFA students through Augsburg University too in a low-res situation. So I've been able to mentor people who are all over the state. I mean, all over the U.S. and even outside the U.S. sometimes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and for being here in Tulsa. And we hope you'll come back again and again.
I love it here.
Thank you for watching.